Does the Second Amendment protect private gun rights, or is it just a collective right? Do technological advancements make a right outdated? Is the phrase well-regulated synonymous with gun control? And who exactly is the militia? Also, should citizens be allowed to own nuclear weapons? In this video, I'll be answering these questions and more as we debunk 6 lies about the Second Amendment. And by the end of the video, you should have a much better idea of what the phrase well-regulated actually means. So let's get started. Anti-Second Amendment lie number 1. The Second Amendment does not protect private ownership.
False.
This lie can be heard throughout universities, spewed by mainstream media, posited by politicians, and then of course in the comment section of my videos. Let's take a look at some examples. USA Today said, "There is no individual right to bear arms in the Bill of Rights." And then the New York Post said, "Law-abiding Americans have no unconditional right to firearms access." And then consider this quote, "The sale, manufacture, and possession of handguns ought to be banned. We do not believe the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to keep them." The Washington Post. Regardless of the source, this lie is promulgated by those who are uninformed by history and who lack basic reading comprehension skills. This lie is rooted in an ignorance for the prevalence of private arms ownership throughout history, an unwillingness to acknowledge the plain language of the Second Amendment, and a misunderstanding of certain terms within that article. I'll reserve the historical significance of private arms ownership for later in the video. And for now, I'm going to focus on the placement of the Second Amendment within the Bill of Rights, its language, and the meaning of certain terms like militia and well-regulated. After reading the plain language of the First, Second, Third, and Fourth Amendments, it's clear as day that they share a common theme. And that theme is the protection of the rights afforded to the people. Not to groups, not to the collective, not to the states, but to the people. And that's you and me. Imagine for a second that the First or Fourth Amendments were to be taken as a collective right. If this were the case, individual expression under the First Amendment would be drastically limited. Only speech or religious practices endorsed by the majority would be protected, and this would lead to marginalizing minority dissenting opinions. Additionally, if the Fourth Amendment were a collective right, the government could have broader latitude to conduct searches and seizures so long as it served the collective interest. Or if it pertained to a state's rights, this would be like saying that it only protected the right of the state legislators, the police, or the National Guard to assemble peacefully. And unfortunately, during COVID, we got a glimpse of this when the supposed greater good was prioritized over individual liberties. But I hope we all can agree that the First and Fourth Amendments protect the rights of the individual. So, as we consider the mere placement of the Second Amendment amongst its peers, at a minimum, we can draw a powerful inference that each of the first few amendments were cut from the same cloth. And to cut one of them out and suggest that it does not protect an individual right is illogical at best and nefariously disingenuous at worst. Okay, so next let's look at the mere language of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Consider the grammatical composition of this article. The first part gives us the why behind the second part. You see, many of the founding fathers were very wary of standing militaries. They believed that armed citizens were much more useful for protecting the security of a free state. And then after providing us with the why, the amendment provides us with the individual right. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It would be like me saying a well-functioning and honest media being necessary to the distribution of truth, the right of the people to own and use communication tools shall not be infringed. Now, in this hypothetical right, I'm not saying that we need a well-functioning and honest media as a prerequisite. That first part is simply stating the why it's important to protect the right to own and use communication tools. And to stretch this analogy a little bit further, it would also be foolish to interpret this as suggesting that the only communication tools that this would protect would be limited to those in existence during its ratification. Now, I guess I really shouldn't be surprised if the average person misunderstands the structure of the Second Amendment, because here's what former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Burger, had to say. The need for a state militia was the predicate of the right guarantee, so as to protect the security of the state. So we can see here that even a Supreme Court judge has a hard time understanding a simple article. But not only did he fail at reading comprehension, he He also failed to see that the article is concerned with the security of a free state, not simply the security of the state. And this is the crux of the issue and where most people are divided on the topic. Throughout the world, there are national constitutions that prioritize the security of the state. However, the citizens of these states are not free individuals, but subjects to the state. Let me restate that. If your country does not protect your individual right to speech, private arms ownership, and other rights found in the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights, then you are not a free citizen, but a subject to the state. Singaporeans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the British, Canadians, Australians, Germans, and many other citizens around the world who are not afforded the right to arm themselves are not free men, but they are subjects to the government and the whims of those in power. Consider this quote: "The most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to allow the subjected people to carry arms. History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subjected people to carry arms have prepared their own fall." Adolf Hitler. Hitler understood that an armed populace would be much more difficult to tyrannize and haul off to gas chambers and concentration camps. So Hitler exploited the Weimar Republic's gun registry to accomplish his Gun Control Act. Next, consider this. In Federalist 46, Madison discusses the risk posed by standing armies and emphasizes the importance of private arms ownership as a safeguard against the potential for government tyranny. Madison outlines how an armed populace serves as a critical balance against the power of the federal government and to deter against the misuse of a federal standing army. And then in the 1866 Freedmen's Bureau Act, which is often considered the Siamese twin to the Civil Rights Act, it spoke of the full benefit of all laws and proceedings concerning personal liberty, personal security, and property, including the constitutional right to bear arms. But you might be left asking, okay, but what about this militia thing? And we'll get to this in the third anti-Second Amendment lie. But first, let's address another lie, and that is anti-Second Amendment lie number 2. The Second Amendment doesn't protect military-grade weapons and is outdated due to technological advancements.
Series 4 deatomizer.
That's what I'm talking about.
Noisy cricket.
Many who believe this lie claim that muskets were the most advanced weapons in 1791 when the amendment was ratified, and that the Founding Fathers had no foresight about weapons innovation.
Did you see the muskets he had? Magnificent. Hand me the quill so I can draw them before I forget.
Contrary to popular belief, the musket was not the most advanced weapon when the Second Amendment was ratified. There were, in fact, repeating rifles that were capable of firing multiple shots without the need for reloading. And this one might surprise you, but in 1718, a London lawyer by the name of James Puckle invented the Puckle gun, aka the defense gun. This gun worked in a similar manner to how a revolver worked and could fire 9 rounds, one after the other, before needing to be reloaded. So no, the musket was not the most advanced weapon during 1791. However, it was one of the most common in use during that time, just as the AR-15 is today. And next, I want to dispel the absolutely erroneous idea that the Founding Fathers had no foresight for weapons innovation.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
What if someone made a gun that could shoot, say, 50 people in 30 seconds?
And in my opinion, this fallacy is rooted in the flawed thinking that people from long ago are that much different from the people of today. This line of thinking ignores that people of any era understand and have an awareness of their frame of reference along the timeline of human history. And this very awareness gives each generation the ability to imagine, predict, and anticipate potential advancements in technology. And the authors of the US Constitution were very educated in the history of warfare and technological advancements of weapons. And they would have surely known that the musket was simply another point along the continuum of weapons technology. It's silly and laughable to assume that the men responsible for the single greatest constitution in the history of nations lacked the foresight to see that the musket would be to some future weapon what the bow was to the musket. And bear in mind that making a right dependent on technological advancements opens the door to reevaluating every other right. Take the freedom of speech. one could easily argue that advancements in communications technology would be much more surprising to the founders than advancements in small arms tech. Imagine if you were able to go back in time with something like the AR-15 and then the iPhone.
Whoa, this is heavy.
Held an AR-15 in my hand. It is as heavy as 10 boxes.
There's that word again, heavy.
I guarantee that the technology inside this iPhone would be far more impressive to someone like Ben Franklin. If you were to simply demonstrate the ability of an iPhone to video call with multiple people all over the world, Benjamin Franklin would be far more amazed by that technology than a gun that could simply reload itself.
Wait, Scott!
Especially when you consider that self-loading guns already existed at that time. So with this in mind, if you're going to posit that rights are dependent on technology, then you must also concede that the First Amendment is much more susceptible to government regulations. Now, if you want to make the case that 18th century scientists could not perceive the invention of the atom bomb, then keep watching, because I'll cover this towards the end of the video. But for now, here's a quote from Justice Clarence Thomas. Quote, "The Second Amendment extends prima facie to all instruments that constitute bearable arms, even those that were not in existence at the time of the founding." So no, our rights are not only applicable to the era in which they were ratified in or abrogated by technology, but they are temporally and technologically independent. So next, let's address the most overused lie. Anti-Second Amendment lie number 3. Well-regulated means government regulation, gun control, and or the militia is referring to the National Guard or police. In a statement filed by 52 professors and historians in a Second Amendment lawsuit, they claimed the Second Amendment protects only the right to bear arms for the purpose of service in the militia and not firearms ownership unrelated to militia service. And then the ACLU undermined their credibility for protecting civil liberties when they said that the individual right to bear arms applies only to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. Except for lawful police and military purposes, the possession of weapons by individuals is not constitutionally protected. This lie is sort of tied to the first lie that it doesn't protect the right to private ownership, and it stems from the confusion about whom the founders believed were the militia, in addition to a misunderstanding about the meaning of well-regulated. But before we get into defining legal terms, consider these quotes regarding how we should interpret a legal document like the Constitution and its Bill of Rights. And if you prefer to skip ahead, then skip ahead to this timestamp. Thomas Jefferson, skilled with uncanny precognition, commented very clearly on how the Constitution should be read when he said, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning can be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one which was passed." And as James Madison stated, "I entirely concur in the priority of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution." What a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. And then, according to Chief Justice Howard Taft, they, the framers of our Constitution, expressed themselves in terms of the common law, confident that they could be short and easily understood. And then, one of the original Supreme Court justices, James Wilson, declared, "The first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it." And then finally, as Justice Joseph Story, who was appointed by James Madison, stated, "The first and fundamental rule in the interpretation of all documents is to construe them according to the sense of the terms and the intentions of the parties." Man, that was an exhaustive list, and if you listened to that whole thing, then I applaud you and thank you for bearing with me. But now that we've covered the importance of interpreting a legal document through its original meaning, let's now acknowledge the reality of how certain words lose their meaning over time. For instance, consider the word gentleman. And if you've read C.S. Lewis, then you should be familiar with this example. But the original meaning of the term gentleman was to describe someone who had a coat of arms and owned property. And when you called someone a gentleman, you were saying nothing of that person's character or temperament.
Done deal. Thank you very much, sir. You're a gentleman and a scholar. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. My mistake. That was a woman I was talking to. So.
In the original meaning, you were simply stating a fact like you would be doing today if you called someone a homeowner. A gentleman could have been a jerk, could have been a womanizer, or could have led a generally unscrupulous lifestyle. And this would have not contradicted the claim that they were a gentleman because it was not a measure of character. However, in the present day, the term has essentially lost its meaning and therefore any usefulness at all. Now the word gentleman is synonymous with words like nice, kind, polite, generous, etc. Now hopefully you're still with me after that exhaustive setup, but I wanted to drive the point home that interpreting a legal document like the Bill of Rights must be done in the context of when it was written and with an understanding of what the words meant at that time. So with this in mind, let's see if we can interpret the original meaning of well-regulated. Jack Ricot, I hope that's how you pronounce it.
Balake.
My name's Blake.
He's a Stanford professor of political science and law, and he explains that well-regulated in the 18th century tended to be something like well-organized, well-armed, well-disciplined. It means the militia was in an effective shape to fight. And then in Federalist 29, Hamilton outlines the meaning of well-regulated militia for what he refers to as the people at large. About halfway through Federalist 29, Hamilton explains that little more can be expected than to have the people properly armed and equipped, and that they should assemble once or twice in the course of a year. Now you might be saying, see, the militia is supposed to be training regularly, be well organized and disciplined, and I would agree. However, I would also refer you back to my honest media analogy. While it's true that having a well-functioning and honest media is necessary for the dissemination of truth, this should not be a requirement to own communication tools and other printing devices or to speak freely. Now let's move on to determine who is the militia. If you were to ask most contemporary Americans who they believe is the modern militia, many would guess that the state or National Guards would fill that role, or maybe even the local police. However, the 18th century definition of militia was much different, and they would have considered any type of armed government agency as either a select corps or a select militia. And these groups would have been viewed by the founders with the same disdain as they had for standing armies. And even under federal law, the citizenry is divided into two subsets. You have the organized militia, which is composed of the National Guard, and then you have the unorganized militia, which is composed of all able-bodied males between the ages of 17 and 45. So right here we can see that the militia is not the National Guard. The militia is composed of the body of people, and this is supported throughout the Federalist Papers. Consider this quote by James Madison that follows nearly identical to the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the best and most natural defense of a free country. Notice how he said the defense of a free country and not the defense of the state. And then this by George Mason. I ask, who are the militia? They consist of the whole people, except a few public officers. So here we are told that public office may actually preclude someone from being a member in the militia, which undermines the assertion that the militia mentioned in the Second Amendment is state-run. Like we discussed earlier, over time, the definitions of some terms evolve, and sometimes to the point where the term's original meaning is completely lost. And some people are trying to do that with a definition of a woman, but that's for another video. But it's important that we use the original definition when reading and interpreting legal documents. And that brings us to the end of the 3 anti-Second Amendment lies. And next I'll be covering 3 pro-Second Amendment lies. And based on my 6 lies about the AR-15 video, I'm sure to anger just as many ideologues on the right as I have on the left, but oh well, let's keep going. Pro-Second Amendment lie number 1. I am the militia.
Take a good look at the face of the militia and the 3% movement.
Now, I've already addressed that the well-regulated militia was not referring to the National Guard or government regulation, but instead that it's referring to the people being ready and equipped for warfare. But you can't claim to be a member of a well-regulated militia if you can't even regulate your own body weight. There's a reason the military has fitness standards, despite these lowering standards in recent years. This is because physical fitness is a fundamental tenet of combat readiness. Not least because physical fitness often correlates to personal responsibility, but also because your body is the primary weapon through which you wield other weapons. Consider what you think of when you see an out of shape and overweight cop. Most people, especially criminals, see overweight cops as complacent, unfit for the job, and waiting on retirement. And the same goes for our military. When I see a soldier who's overweight, I wonder how we would fare in a near-peer engagement with militaries who care more about combat readiness and less about equity. And the next aspect of being well-regulated is training. It's both laughable and naive to call yourself well-regulated if you spend more money on guns and gear than you do on training. George Washington said, "A free people ought not only be armed, but disciplined." And John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And just like I covered in this video, they knew that with rights comes responsibilities. Now, it's important you don't interpret this as me saying that you have to do these things in order to have those rights. This would be like suggesting that you have to get educated or speak truthfully in order to secure your freedom of speech. But as with all rights, as we neglect the responsibility associated with that right, we risk losing the right. And if you want to get one of these well-regulated shirts, then click the link in the description, because it will only be available for 2 weeks after this video drops or while supplies last. And with this, the next pro-Second Amendment lie is Pro 2A, lie number 2. The right to private arms ownership was unique to America. This lie was one that I considered leaving out because it's really not that contentious compared with the others. But I've heard some people claim that the right to bear arms was as unique and groundbreaking as some of the other pillars, like the concept of innocence until proven guilty. But this is simply not the case. The right to own guns goes much further back than the 18th century. And the founders had been educated in the classical European tradition of the right and often the responsibility of citizens to be armed. Consider this by Aristotle. The whole Constitution set up is intended to be neither democracy nor oligarchy, but midway between the two, what is sometimes called polity, the members of which are those who bear arms. And then when he said, "A king's bodyguard is composed of the citizens carrying arms, a tyrant's of foreign mercenaries. For those who possess and can wield arms are in a position to decide whether the Constitution is to continue or not." And then this quote by Tullius Cicero that I won't read entirely, but feel free to pause the video and read for yourself. And there are many other quotes just like these that I'll put in the description and maybe the comment section. And then in 1689, with the passing of the English Declaration of Rights, the Declaration included 13 basic rights. This was known as the English Bill of Rights, where we got our name, the Bill of Rights. The 7th of which proclaimed that it was the right of all Protestants to have arms for their defense, suitable to their condition and as allowed by law. All in all, the Second Amendment's protection of the individual rights to bear arms is not as groundbreaking and as novel as some of the other concepts, such as the separation of powers, the presumption of innocence, and several others. Although it could be argued that they prioritized and even generalized that right more heavily than in the past. Okay, now let's move on to the final lie. Pro-Second Amendment, lie number 3. The Second Amendment protects my right to own nuclear weapons. No, I hate to break it to you, but the Second Amendment does not protect your right to own nuclear weapons. But if you want to see why, then check out this video. And if you haven't already, then scan this QR code or click the link in the description to pick up your well-regulated shirt over at our merch store, because once again, it will only be available for 2 weeks once this video drops or while supplies last. But thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, train to a higher standard.